Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, John Oliphant.
Thank you very much, Program Director. I must say that Honorable Peter Beattie, I hope I pronounced it appropriately, he has really set the scene. I mean, across all my travels, I haven't met a politician that reflects as well as he did. And also, I think what he said about the challenges that face Australia, I think we're facing very similar challenges ourselves. We are a resource-based economy. So I think some of the few notes that I've captured that I'll obviously reflect on my 11-hour flight to South Africa, it's about how do we move away from a resource-based economy and start preparing for the post-resource economy. But my presentation today really is just to give you a case study of how we're dealing with that type of a future at the GEPF. I've got a lot of slides, but I'm going to try to go through them very quickly so that I can touch on a whole lot of topics, give you a bit of a background on our investment strategy and approach, and then focus on investment opportunities. In terms of background, I mean, the GEPF, like in the opening remarks has been said, is the largest pension fund in Africa. Our assets under management is 1 trillion, and that is roughly about 130 billion Australian dollars. We've got about 1.2 million active members and about 320,000 pensioners. And obviously, in terms of the governance structure, it's very similar to your SUP funds here. You've got employer-employee representatives, and so forth. So if we look at how we approach investments as the Government Employees Pension Fund, we look at what are the objectives, and this is what is said in the rules of the fund. We don't necessarily have any discretion on it. We are a DB fund, so we have to deliver those benefits to the members. But what we do have discretion on is the right side, where we can make decision on asset allocation, make decision on investments in terms of which asset classes, and so forth. So what we try and do is to come up with a strategy that gives us a better chance to achieve our objectives in relation to the fund. So this is a little bit of optimization, but we use a liability-driven investment approach. So we don't try and shoot out the lights. We try to outperform the liabilities of the fund. Our liabilities are in the region of, in terms of duration, it's about 30 years. So we need to look for excellent assets that can match that duration, and we are able to provide long-term benefits in a sustainable fashion towards our members. So after all that exercise, obviously, we arrive at a strategic asset allocation, and you would see that it's biased towards South Africa. And this is, I think, most pension funds worldwide, they do have a home bias in relation to their approach. But the GEPF, for example, given that it's a government employees pension fund, the challenge we have here is that the fund has, when it derives its investment strategy, has to do so in consultation with the Minister of Finance. So what often happens is that from 1996 to now, the fund was not allowed to invest any money outside South Africa. But under the current new leadership in government, they've managed to open up their minds, and they've introduced a small exposure to markets outside South Africa. So now we are allowed to invest up to 9% outside Africa and another extra 5% in Africa, excluding South Africa. In terms of our assets, you can see that, I mean, we were impacted by the global financial crisis like any other market. But I think what is inspiring is how the assets managed to grow post that. And that's mainly a function of, you know, our concentration towards South Africa and our little bit of exposure towards other economies now. And then also at the time when we transitioned the portfolio to introduce global equity and global bonds, we were able to do so in the context of where the rand was extremely strong relative to the US dollar. So the timing was almost perfect for us. But now, the most important issue that I think we could share today or interact on, it's really about the integration of sustainability issues within investments. And this definition, I got it from a professor, I think is Australian, when I came here in Sydney at the UN-backed PRI annual event. And he said he's not going to try and define what responsible investing is, but he can say what is irresponsible investing. And he said that, you know, if we are being irresponsible if we invest in things that cost the economy something today, but it's not necessarily priced in. And I think this is a perfect definition of what is irresponsible. And I think coming back to the remarks by Peter earlier on, to say that Australians are innovating but not taking their ideas to the market, I think a good example is the UN-backed PRI. I mean, it was a PhD study of James Gifford, and that's how the PRI was born. So I think that's one great example of an Australian that is continuing to change the world. So now, the GPF is one of the founding signatories to the UN PRI, and it also has a policy on responsible investing. But we believe these issues are very important given the trend that we've observed in global warming. It is very clear that the world is warming, but on a more serious note, that has a great impact on a whole lot of issues. Food security becomes an issue, ecosystems, extreme weather-related events, all those are the impacts that scientists have predicted, and some of it we're starting to observe it already. I mean, if you take the example of South Africa, you would see that in the current situation, and you look at soil moisture days in South Africa, that's the number of days in which we could plant something, it grows, and we harvest. If you look at it, the average soil moisture days currently in South Africa is sitting at about 80 days in a 360 year. Now, if nothing is done about climate change and you fast forward that into the future, you would see there when you're looking at the dark orange area, you can see that soil moisture days, soil moisture days drop drastically in half, and obviously that will have a major impact on food security. So based on our analysis, we realized that most of the GPF pensioners, they spend 70% of their money on food. So now, if you fast forward that picture to 2050, whoever that is providing for retirement, it will become unaffordable to retire comfortably, because most of the things that you need to secure when you're at retirement, food and medical and all that, they've all been impacted significantly by climate change. So for us as long-term investment thinkers, it's critical that we are able to integrate all these issues in our investment thinking. Another example here, you can see what has happened to insurance claims related to great weather-related events, and all that, it's all pointing in the direction that scientists were correct in terms of their predictions. In Australia, you've got a recent experiences of floods and so forth. We've experienced similar in South Africa. All these things are reflecting what scientists predicted years back, and we're starting to experience it today. So our view is that we need to invest in a way that we are able to assist our government. I mean, if you look at this picture, which is the emissions of South Africa, if you look at our growth plans going forward, you know we are a resource-based economy, you can see that our emissions will continue to increase, but what is required by science is that our emission must not grow. So you can see that the gap is quite huge, and our view is that that gap presents excellent investment opportunities. We don't believe that climate change is just an issue for politicians. We believe that the transition from being a brown economy to being a green economy will require investment capital. So that's why we believe that we need to be actively involved in ensuring that we pursue investment opportunities that will narrow the gap. So this is, I think, a view that is shared by many institutions globally. You can see that there's a greater drive towards integration of environmental and social and governance issues. In South Africa, we've got our own stewardship code, which is called CRISA, the Code for Responsible Investing in South Africa. OECD also recommends that pension funds should integrate ESG issues. So you can see that globally, there is a clear move that there is a greater opportunity to address the gap. So what should happen going forward? We believe that in the climate change talks, for example, investors need to be actively involved because they need to play a more active role in allocating capital towards the transition. The CRISA was designed such that it makes the UN-backed PRI more implementable in the context of South Africa. So all pension funds in South Africa going forward are required by law to integrate environmental, social, and governance issues. And then the CRISA becomes the code that gives trustees and of pensions the opportunity to reflect and be able to integrate such within their investment policy statements. In terms of new growth opportunities, which I think also reflects on the previous speaker, we view that, we've experienced great growth over the last 10 years, and you can see that Australia, on that graph there, it's well presented in terms of assets under management, doubled over the last decade. But obviously, going forward, the investment environment it's different, and we need to start thinking differently. The integration of ESG issues, the transitioning of the economy to making it more greener, it presents other investment opportunities. But you also have to look in other parts of the world to pursue greater growth going forward. You can see that we've seen great growth, which is what I've just said, but now my view of the world, it's really summarized in this slide. If we talk about growth and you look at Africa, Africa contributes to global GDP about 1.5%. South Africa, it's 0.5% of Africa of global GDP, so it makes South Africa a third of Africa's GDP relative to the world. And then you can see that Australia is at 1.7. So now, if you think about growth, you'll start to see that bigger economies will narrow down and new emerging economies will become bigger. I mean, before the financial crisis, for example, the US economy was 28% of global GDP. Today, they are sitting at 23.4% of GDP, of global GDP. China was at about 5% of global GDP. Now they're sitting at about 7.1% of global GDP. So if you want growth, you need to concentrate on economies that will become future leaders of global economy going forward. Our view is that Africa presents an excellent investment opportunity. I'm not standing here just because I'm an African, I'm selling Africa, but my view is that if you're looking for growth in many countries that I've been to, it's amazing stories in terms of what the world is going to provide. And most research is also giving you that example. You can see that most of the growth over the next 3 to 4 years will come from emerging markets. So it's important in your investment strategy, you start allocating sufficient funds towards emerging economies. Now, if you look at what makes African story more exciting, if you look in the 1940s or so, you can see there were a lot of conflicted areas denoted by blue. And you look at the picture in 2009, this study was done just before the Arab Spring. But even then, if you consider that part of it, which most people in their investment strategy put it as part of the Middle East type Arab nations, you can see that the rest of Africa as a continent, it's post-conflict in terms of issues within the continent. And what we know about conflict in South Africa, it's a very good example. You know that we had to endure apartheid for many years. And in 1990, Nelson Mandela was released from prison. And you can see that post that era, what has happened to economic growth. So that gives you an example that political reform, obviously supported by proper policies like monetary and fiscal policies, will lead to economic growth. So if you go to the previous slide and we say that Africa is now not as conflicted as it was in the past, this slide tells you that if you've got a far better chance of growth going forward if you put the right policies in place. And I think South Africa is almost becoming a good case study for most of our neighbors within the continent, and that's why I believe that the Africa story is even more exciting. In terms of opportunities, we think if you look at energy, we think there'll be a greater demand for energy within the continent. We believe there'll be more cities within the continent that require infrastructure, ICT infrastructure, transportation infrastructure. All those things, in my opinion, they present investment opportunities. If you look at the GEPF, for example, our funding level, it's sitting at 100% as per our last statutory valuation. If you can travel around the world, you will know that most pension funds are below 100% funding level. If you look at what we do, we continue doing simple things. We don't buy funny stuff, we buy things that we understand. We own infrastructure, we own roads, we own airports, we own properties. Those are type of investments that make a difference, but they provide an excellent investment return for the portfolio. So we don't do funny things, we keep things simple. So now if you look at what is the role of the GEPF, I think this slide summarizes what we're trying to achieve. And I think when I've been reading financial news within Australia, I think there's a greater requirement, or at least politicians are debating to say that funds here needs to be more active in the economy, invest in infrastructure and so forth. We obviously have passed that stage. If you think about the GEPF, GEPF's assets, it's 1 trillion. in an economy of 2.8 trillion. So we are a third of the country's GDP. So what we thought is that if the country does not do well, the fund will not do well because we own a slice of the economy. Anything that you care to see when you arrive in South Africa, whether you're at OR Tambo International Airport, whether you're driving on our roads, whether you're buying food in the shops, whether you're staying in the hotel, we own a piece of it. So it is critical for us to ensure that the manner in which we invest somehow benefits the economy and also benefits the GEPF. Now, what we've came up with a framework that will ensure that we are able to achieve those objectives without compromising our fiduciary responsibilities towards the members and the pensioners. So in the top right quadrant is those type of investment opportunities that provides excellent investment return, but at the same time have a high impact on society, high impact on environment, and high impact on governance. Obviously, on the left top quadrant, we believe that's what government should do, because government will invest in an economy. They don't necessarily expect to make investment returns, but they expect to make political returns, excellent harmony in society, and so forth. So you can see that in that spectrum, we've placed ourselves in the top right quadrant to say this is where we need to play. The bottom right quadrant presents what I think is current thinking within pension funds, and I think it might be the same thing here, where environmental, social, and governance issues are not even considered. People are just chasing returns at all costs. So our view is that the portfolio needs to be transitioned from the bottom to the top if we are to have a more sustainable economy going forward. So in terms of that framework, we've came up with what we call the developmental investment framework, and it's based on 4 pillars. And if you listen about my story of owning a slice of the economy, you will believe that investments in economic infrastructure becomes critical. In 2006-2007, BHP, Billiton, and Anglo-American had to shut down their aluminum smelters in order for the country to be able to have enough supply of energy. And that had major impact on the economy. So that just gives you an example of, you know, a not so secure supply of electricity can have a massive impact on GDP. So when we look at all those things, we're saying economic infrastructure, to us, it presents an excellent investment opportunity. And in that pillar, we'll be pursuing investments in transport, rail, and all and that. And then the second pillar, we're saying we want to make investments in social infrastructure. And I think a practical example is the members of the GEPF. Members of the GEPF are people that have sacrificed so much for our country. They work as policemen, teachers, nurses, right? But when you look at them individually in terms of the salaries they earn, they cannot afford to buy a house, okay? But collectively, they are the richest South Africans. So what we said is that, what is it that is causing the problem in terms of supply of affordable homes in South Africa? We realized that there was a gap between houses that are being provided by government and houses that are being mortgaged. And we said in that gap in between, economics tells us that if there's greater demand, we will have the pricing power and you'll be able to make excellent investment returns. So within this pillar, we'll be able to make those investments in housing. Another example within the social infrastructure is investments in education. We find that the very same GPF members, policemen, nurses, teachers, in most instances, they cannot afford to take their children to university. And we believe that education is a critical element if South Africa is to become a successful economy. Now, when we looked at it, we find that there's a whole lot of institutions that come and borrow money from the GPF, so they'll issue a credit note, and then they take that money and then invest in education by giving loans to our members. So what we've noticed is that our members, they pay high interest rates to borrow their own money. So we're also trying to get rid of the middleman and deal directly with our members to ensure. And all these things present excellent investment opportunities. The third pillar, it's based on my initial discussion about climate change and our view that the transition to a clean economy needs to be funded by investors. So in the third pillar, we'll be pursuing investments in the renewable energy. You know that South Africa is one of the largest emitters within the African continent, and the South African government has committed itself to ensuring that that picture changes. So we are saying that that transition towards a more cleaner economy will require investment capital. and we want to play a far bigger role within that. The fourth pillar somehow relates to the previous speaker's discussion, enterprise development. He called it commercialization of ideas. This is the fourth pillar. We believe enterprise development and job creation is critical if we are to ensure a sustainable economy. And we've had excellent investment opportunities. And a good example for us is a cell phone company. We own a big chunk of cell phone companies in South Africa. Such institutions were non-existent 15 years ago. Today, they are multinational companies and have made excellent investment returns, and in the process have created thousands of jobs. So we believe that the fourth pillar, it gives you an excellent investment opportunities that you could pursue that can deliver high growth and so forth. And then obviously in South Africa, we've got a unique situation, which is the broad black-based economic empowerment. You know that South African population, it's about 48 million people. The white South Africans, it's about 6 million people, and they control 80% of the economy. So government has put in place a policy to say, how do we transition so that the majority of South Africans participate in the major economy? And we believe that we're not going to the Zimbabwean style, obviously. We're buying that economic interest, and the funding of it, that's where we see our role, where we're saying, how do we fund black entrepreneurs who wants to buy equity stakes in previously white institutions? And it becomes a partnership that works because for procurement in South Africa, it's important for an institution to be transformed. If you are not transformed, you won't be able to get any business. So you can see that white people who own businesses in South Africa, they require black partners. And we are saying in getting those black partners, how do we facilitate for them to acquire those stakes and so forth? So that's where the broad-based black economic empowerment comes in. If you do have investments in South Africa, this is a critical element that you need to evaluate and ensure that the companies in which you invest have an excellent broad-based black economic empowerment. And I think this applies across the continent because the majority of the 1 billion Africans are not really participating in the real economy. In terms of investment opportunities that we have invested in as the GPF, we've owned an airport in Tunisia together with TAV, which is a Turkish entity. And that is an excellent investment. I mean, obviously, with the Arab Spring there, it has had a little bit of an impact, but it's a 40-year concession, and we believe that North Africa becomes a critical element for Africa's North region, and we've got 2 airports that we own in Tunisia. And then main one, which is an undersea cable coming from Portugal, landing in Nigeria, which connects the rest of Africa to, at least West Africa to the rest of the world. And I think that investment is one good example of venture capital. This lady that started Main One, she spent about 20 years in the US, managing one of the big telecom companies. And what he found, she wanted to go back to Nigeria, and they visited Nigeria with his kids. And the kids, when I arrived there, they realized that they could not watch their videos on YouTube, they could not be on Twitter, they could not be on Facebook. And they said to the mother, we're not coming back to Nigeria, we are happy in the US. And the mother said, oh, what am I going to do with this problem? That's how she started that business. It's doing extremely well. Great demand for what we are doing there. And the second leg of that cable will be coming down to Cape Town. That's the second phase of the project. And you would know that there's a great demand now going forward in terms of data, and it's important that that infrastructure is put in place, and it also presents an excellent long-term investment opportunity. There's quite a lot of investment opportunities that we can talk about during question and answer session. The other slide that I showed you in terms of the economic size of Africa relative to the rest of the world, you saw Africa appeared very small in that picture. I thought I should help for those who don't have an understanding of how big the continent is. And this gives you a good idea of how big Africa is. I thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you can.